Well, now I'm going to hand things over to, as we're talking about how to help victims, as well as more statistics on what's happened. James Lee is the Chief Operating Officer of the ID Theft Resource Center. ITRC has been a great partner of ours on this event the last couple of years, and they are about to announce, they've just released, I believe, their annual data breach report, which, while probably depressing, at least is going to have some good new data for us. So James, let me hand things over to you.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. And I need to also thank Susan for her kind words and recognition for now what the ITRC has been doing for more than 20 years. We certainly appreciate that. One of the things we do at the ITRC is we do look at data breach information. And I'm sorry to say, it says that screen sharing is disabled, so I can't bring up my slides. I'm not sure.
Let's see if Dustin can handle
that. You can
that.
go ahead and try again, James.
Ah, there we go. Okay. So pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. Let's start out with what we did report earlier today, but before that, just the commercial announcement. If you're not aware of who the ITRC is, we are a nonprofit. We're based in San Diego, California, and we are here to help victims of identity crimes and compromises, as well as businesses and government agencies. With the whole idea, we want to reduce the risk and mitigate the risk associated with both crimes and compromise. And I also have to thank our partners at Sontiq for making this report we're about to look at possible. Last year, it was a big year. 1,862 compromises, 293, almost 294 million victims. And obviously, that's going to include some duplication because people are hit multiple times. It's also a conservative estimate because not every organization reports how many people are impacted by a breach. Sometimes they'll report records, sometimes they report individuals, sometimes they report nothing at all. We're going to talk about that in just a second. So if you break that out across the 4 categories that we track: data breaches, which is where data is exfiltrated; data exposures, which is available for viewing, available for misuse, but there's no evidence it was actually copied or exfiltrated; data leaks, which is information that is otherwise public but aggregated, usually through scraping and then kept in an open database. And then lastly, we have a few that we just don't know. We know there was a breach that said we had a breach, but they had released no details about whatsoever. So those are last year's statistics. Now, how does that compare to our previous years? This is an all-time high. 1,862 is 68% more than last year's 1,108. It's also 23% more than the previous all-time high of 1,506 publicly reported data breaches back in 2017. If you look at just the components of that, there were more cyber attacks in 2021 than every other previous year's every form of attack. So we are seeing a significant increase in overall data breaches, particularly those that are associated with cyber attacks. Sensitive information up slightly within the information that is released, still well below the all-time high, which was back in 2017, where 95% of every breach included some form of sensitive information. And lastly, to point out, before we start digging into the individual components here, supply chain attacks are wrapped up in those cyber attacks. But if you broke them out separately, that would be the 4th most frequent kind of attack, and also increasing year over year to the point where it is almost at the point where it could catch up to malware. Malware has been flat over time, whereas supply chain attacks continue to grow. There were 93 supply chain attacks reported last year that impacted 559 organizations. 122 of those were notices made about a 2020 breach at Blackbaud. So 122 new notices in 2021 of a 2020 attack. Okay, let's start digging into the root causes here. So far and away, cyber attacks, the bulk of the root cause. That the constituent component for victims is a little short of 189 million people, but it's really concentrated in those top three vectors. It's the broad phishing and related attacks, including business email compromise. It's ransomware, and then malware right behind that. Then there's a big fall off, as you can see, including where there are non-secured cloud databases, but they are attacked. So the data is actually exfiltrated. So we count that slightly differently. If we go to the next, you'll see there's a huge fall off from 1,600 attacks to 179 breaches and exposures caused by either a human or a system error. We still see email attacks in the sense, or not email attacks, email breaches in the sense that somebody attaches a file that they shouldn't and sends reply all. You still see that. You still see paper files being physically mailed, not to the degree that they have historically, but it still happens. We're also continuing to see cloud databases with no security. It's not just as simple as they didn't put the password on the cloud environment. That's still a significant number. And of these victims within this constituent part, the vast majority of those are because of that lack of security on a cloud database. Move on to the next one. Physical attacks is our third category. Only 51 breaches and exposures. You do still see people stealing their laptops and with data on it. It rarely is that a targeted attack. It's an attack of opportunity. I want to back up just 1 second here, because you see here on the bottom here, other non-specified, 19 attacks, 34 non-specified under system and human errors, and then cyber attacks. Two categories here that are related: other non-specified 436, not available 106. These are all reflective of the trend we're going to talk about in just a second. What's the type of data that we are seeing? Obviously, no surprise, the top data attribute would be your name. That's the thing that is breached more often than not, followed by social security numbers, dates of birth, addresses, other kinds of health information. But then you get down to, I want to point out this next category, which is driver's license or state ID numbers, and to an extent, even bank account numbers. Those two constituent parts did see an increase in 2021. There was a big increase in social security numbers. We're going to talk about that in a second. But driver's license and bank accounts in particular also saw a big jump. Driver's license, because historically there hasn't been a lot you can do short of get into a bar if you're underage, or you can try to pretend to be somebody else to get out of a ticket or some other kind of criminal offense. That's been about the only reason you had a driver's license be the number stolen, and maybe they created a new fake ID with it. However, the increased use now of driver's license with authentication as a key component of being able to access accounts, we're now seeing demand for driver's license increase significantly, which leads to this point. If the slide will move, that availability of data does not equal the value of that data to an identity criminal. So we saw large numbers of social security numbers included in the data that was acquired last year. That does not mean necessarily that that's what they're after. It just means that's what they got. They already have social security numbers, in large quantities, and that's reflected here in the relative value. This comes from a price list that's published by a group called Privacy Affairs, where they track the value of data fields, data elements on the dark web. So you'll see here, a social security number is only worth $2. That's because of the ubiquity of it. They're available, more for a child's for different reasons, but still readily available, very low value. What's a higher value? If you got a selfie holding an ID, that's worth $100. a New York driver's license, just a scan, not a fake driver's license, just a scan of it is worth $80. If we had another page of this, you'd also see that logins and passwords associated with email, particularly Gmail, is worth $80. So the relative value is not reflective of necessarily the quantity of information that's available through these identity marketplaces. So $80 for your Gmail, $2 for your social security number, yet we don't think of the fact we need to protect that credential, that login, that password, to the same degree that we need to protect our social security numbers. This shows out the breakout of the difference between how much overall information and how much of it is sensitive. So this goes back to the statistic we talked about just a second ago, and that being back in 2017, which is the previous all-time high, that 95% of those attacks involve some form of sensitive, personally identifiable information. Today, in this past year, even though we set a new all-time high, it's still only 83%, still too high, but only 83% of all of those data breaches actually expose some form of sensitive information. Let's look at the trends. What does all this mean? So obviously this is the ITRC's view of the world. One good news piece here is the number of victims continues to drop. It's dropped every year for the last 3. So we saw about a 5% drop again in 2021. And the reason we believe that is happening is because, again, of the change in the threat matrix. The threat actors themselves are seeking different information and they're using it differently. Consumers are kind of caught in the middle between the threat actors and the businesses. They really want business they want to either hold them for ransom or use those logins and passwords, for example, to infiltrate systems rather than trying to go in through software flaws or other forms of malware. So consumer data still has value. It is the means to the end, though. What that means is, though, consumers are still at risk. Their data is still being acquired. Their identities are still being compromised, and it is happening multiple times per year to some individuals. So that's still excessively high, but 294 million is not as high as what we have seen historically. And there's every reason to believe that as long as the attack trends remain constant, then the number of victims who are individual victims should continue to drop. Ransomware attacks, based on what we've seen since 2018, this year will surpass phishing as the #1 root cause. It's doubled every year. There's no reason to believe that trajectory is going to change significantly, even if it flattens a little bit with some of the bigger ransomware groups being taken out, at least temporarily, by law enforcement. There's no reason to believe that somebody else is going to just pop up right behind that and continue to engage in ransomware. So if that indeed isn't true, ransomware will become the #1 root cause of data compromises by the end of 2022. The new state privacy laws are very helpful. They're going to give consumers more control of their own data. They're going to give them more transparency and view into how that data is used. But it is going to exacerbate the problem that we already have today of where you live determines if you find out there's been a data breach, what you find about that data breach, when you find out about that data breach, and what resources you are given to either mitigate or recover from any kind of identity crime that might result from that data breach. These 3 laws, which will go into effect a year from now, meaning the CPRA, Colorado and the Virginia laws, when they go into effect, they will be helpful, but they don't meaningfully close this gap of uniformity or lack of uniformity that happens today. So while it's helpful we're going to have these laws, we're probably going to see more this year. Pennsylvania has already proposed some changes that's being considered by their legislature right now. But the fact of the matter is, where you live today determines whether or not you find out you're the victim of an identity breach and what you get to do as a result of that. And it's trying. Okay. Breach notice effectiveness is low and dropping. But I think there we go. I need to back up here. Before we get to the effectiveness, let's look at transparency. Breach notice transparency is going down. We saw that a minute ago when I showed you those individual components about, none of the above or no information. That's a problem, that we're seeing more notices with less information. And as a result of that, we believe that there are more organizations that maybe are not complying with data breach notice as they're imposed by state law. So hard to tell, but the trend line certainly shows a dramatic increase in less information being shared. That hurts businesses that rely on this information to be able to resource plan and to be able to figure out, where do I need to focus my attention because I'm likely to be a victim of a similar attempted attack. And it's harmful for consumers, which we're going to talk about in just a second. The other thing, again, makes compliance questionable is just common sense tells us we are way underreporting breaches in the United States. There are 5 breaches reported on average, 5 a day in the US. There are 356 a day on average reported in the EU. The EU reports more breaches in a day than we do in 2 months. Population's roughly the same. Europe's a little bit larger as an EU, but that tells us right there, we are underreporting data breaches, which means there are threats and risks that are not being addressed. Now let's talk about breach effectiveness. The notices themselves. We did research at the end of last year at the ITRC to kind of dig into this. What do people do when they get a breach notice? And 72%, so nearly 3/4 of people said, yes, I got one. But what did you do? Well, just slightly half of those said, I changed the password on the single account that I was notified had been breached. But we all know from research we've also done at the ITRC and other organizations have done, north of 80% of all people reuse the same password on every account. So changing on one doesn't do much. The more serious thing to us was 16% of the people who said I got a data breach notice. 16% said, but I didn't do anything with it. I didn't do anything because, well, my data's already out there. Or worse than that, probably, the group that lost control of my information, it's their job to clean it up. They'll take care of it. I'm not going to worry about it. And then lastly, only 3% of people who received one of those data breach notices acknowledged that they did the single most effective action they could do, freeze their credit. So only 3% took the action of blocking the ability to open new accounts that involve their credit. That all comes down to the breach effectiveness is low. And we've never tracked this before, so I can't say if it's up, it's down, it's sideways, but it's low. And we need to change that somehow. We need to change that dynamic so people do take action. They do take these things seriously. We've all talked about over time, breach fatigue and notice fatigue. We're well beyond the point of that being an issue. We've got to do something fundamentally different now to make sure people are able to protect themselves and their identities. Speaking of, this is the other commercial announcement part of the program. We at the ITRC are going to launch a free service for consumers later this quarter, where you will be able to come to the ITRC. You'll have the ability to give information about accounts, not any account information per se, but who do you do business with? That if they had a data breach, you'd want to know about. All we need is the name of the company. So you enter the name of the company, up to 5. And if those organizations have ever had a breach, you'll get an immediate reply to that. But in the future, if they have a data breach that is publicly reported, when that is added into our database, then you will receive an alert that the organization you are tracking has indeed reported a data breach. And then you can come to the ITRC's database and find out the particular details of that breach. That helps because increasingly organizations, particularly large organizations, do not necessarily notify people directly. Every state law allows organizations to use an alternate form of notice, and increasingly that is indeed happening. And even when it's not happening, the information included in data breach notices, as we discussed, is wholly inadequate for the purposes of helping people really know what to do to protect themselves for a variety of reasons. Most often than not, they're just so dense, it's difficult for people to understand them. So we will launch this service for consumers for free. And then later in the year, we'll have a service that's companion for businesses where they can do the same thing for their vendors, because those privacy laws we just talked about, they all have components about vendor due diligence and the degree to which you must certify that your vendors and your vendors' vendors are practicing good cybersecurity to protect the information of your customers that you're holding. So we are going to have a paid service for businesses to come in and do the same thing, to track their vendors and their vendors' vendors as well. Okay, in the last few minutes here, let's talk about just the key takeaways. So in 2021, to recap, data compromises, all-time high, 1,862. That's a 68% increase year over year. Number of victims dropped for the third year straight. It's the lowest since 2015. Ransomware is on track to replace phishing as the #1 root cause of data breaches and data compromises in the US. And if it doubles, it will, this year as it has in the past years, it will, surpass it by a significant amount. Data breach notices are containing less information and are less effective than they have been historically. And then lastly, the ITRC is launching a free to consumers breach alert service that'll be available later this quarter and later this year for businesses. Now, Jeremy, I see that there are some questions over here. So we've got a few seconds. Is that okay if I take those, Jeremy?
Yeah, please do.
Okay. So first one, how does that correlate to synthetic manipulated IDs would be interesting. I would think the number of victims going down would be due to the fact that the element of their identity was used, but how would you track this reporting? Very difficult. Yes. Always love when people answer their own questions, but you're exactly right. This goes back to, again, we have such a lack of uniformity in the data that's reported. It's very difficult to particularly be able to trend across states, but it's difficult to track individual data elements like what you're talking about. So is it a uniform breach, or is it a selective breach? And then how does that information actually get used? That's been sort of nirvana. How can you connect a particular breach to a particular then fraud element? Because we've started to draw the distinction at the ITRC between ID theft and ID fraud. Theft is when you steal it, fraud is when you use it. And this really goes to this point of fraud. Next question, the EU stat is interesting. Why does EU report so much more than the US? And do you credit the GDPR for that? Well, yeah, without a doubt, it is GDPR related. Why is it so much often? They have a very different reporting regimen. They have sanctions that have teeth. If you fail to report, there are real consequences, and there are uniform reporting standards. So a business knows what it has to report, by when, to whom, and what information. And then there's the collaboration on the next step of, does the data subject need to be informed or not? So very different, very different, regimen, but clearly effective in terms of generating notices. And so people are aware of what has happened with their information. Next question, with respect to the ITRC breach alerts will be available to Canadians who often use US-based services, will include transported data. It does not matter where you are in the world, you can sign up. It does only, because we only report US credentials and US data. So if it is a global breach that does not impact a U.S. credential or a U.S. resident, then that won't be in the service. But if someone outside the U.S. is using or a customer of a business, and they have a breach, then yes, they'd be alerted to that. And then let's see, I believe we have one more. Oh, it just says, I think maybe you're asking when we'll be offering the breach alert. It's in testing now. We expect to go to beta in the next 30 days and expect to have it in full general release by the end of the first quarter. It's software, so anybody that's done software knows, it gets done eventually. Okay, now we've got two more that come in. Last year, the FCC proposed rules to prevent SIM swapping and port out fraud. How much impact do you see from these type of fraud attempts? Well, not much, frankly, at this point. They're also relatively new, so it may take some time, but it also is wholly dependent on the degree to which the organizations that are subject to that, implement them and implement them quickly. If you followed the mobile telecom world, you know that this was not a good year, particularly for SIM swapping attacks. It's not a good year for some of the carriers. So we probably are going to have to wait a little while longer to see if the efforts of the FCC have been effective in that respect. And then lastly, what communications are government entities consistently providing for victims? Is it solely up to business to provide alerts? Great question. It depends, again, on where you are in the country. If you're in Oregon, for example, and you are the subject of a data breach, then law enforcement is going to determine if you receive a notice. In most other states, however, it is up to the business who has suffered the data breach to determine if there's risk, and if there's risk, then does that meet the standard in that state for issuing a notice. So at this point, by and large, it is all determined by the entity that lost control of the data. That's not to suggest that they don't do the right thing, but again, when you go back to you look at the EU numbers versus the US numbers, common sense tells you there are some breaches that probably should be reported that are not, and it's probably a pretty big number. And with that, Jeremy, my clock says it's high noon, so I thank everyone for your time again. Again, thanks to our friends at Sontiq for making all this possible. And obviously, you can download the report on our website. And if you have any questions, feel free to submit them directly to us at the ITRC. Be happy to answer anything.